Hello, if you like these videos, don't forget to push the like button, share them with your friends, and subscribe. Moon's cat is hiding somewhere in this video. If you find him, there's a prize. Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. Part 5. Read for you today by Hugh Carr. 14. Until he reached the wood, Ransom found it difficult to think of anything except the possibility of another rifle bullet from Weston or Devine. He thought that they probably still wanted him alive rather than dead, and this, combined with the knowledge that a Hross was watching him, enabled him to proceed with at least external composure. Even when he had entered the forest, he felt himself in considerable danger. The long branchless stems made cover only if you were very far away from the enemy, and the enemy in this case might be very close. He became aware of a strong impulse to shout out to Weston and Devine and give himself up. It rationalized itself in the form that this would remove them from the district, as they would probably take him off to the Sorns and leave the Hrossa unmolested. But Ransom knew a little psychology and had heard of the hunted man's irrational instinct to give himself up. Indeed, he had felt it himself in dreams. It was some such trick, he thought, that his nerves were now playing him. In any case, he was determined henceforth to obey the Hrossa or Ildilla. His efforts to rely on his own judgment in Malacandra had so far ended tragically enough. He made a strong resolution, defying in advance all changes of mood, that he would faithfully carry out the journey to Meldalorn if it could be done. This resolution seemed to him all the more certainly right because he had the deepest misgivings about that journey. He understood that the Harandra which he had to cross was the home of the Sorns. In fact, he was walking of his own free will into the very trap that he had been trying to avoid ever since his arrival on Malacandra. Here the first change of mood tried to raise its head. He thrust it down. And even if he got through the Sorns and reached Meldalorn, who or what might Oyasa be? Oyasa, Hwyn had ominously observed, did not share the Hross's objection to shredding the blood of a Hanau. And again, Oyasa ruled Sorns as well as Hrossa and Pfiltrigi. Perhaps he was simply the Arch-Sorn. And now came the second change of mood. Those old terrestrial fears of some alien cold intelligence, superhuman in power, superhuman in cruelty, which had utterly faded from his mind among the Hrossa, rose clamoring for readmission. But he strode on. He was going to Meldalorn. It was not possible, he told himself, that the Hrossa should obey any evil or monstrous creature. And they had told him, or had they? He was not quite sure, that Oyasa was not a Sorn. Was Oyasa a god? Perhaps that very idol to whom the Sorns wanted to sacrifice him. But the Hrossa, though they said strange things about him, clearly denied that he was a god. There was one god, according to them, Maeledil the Young. Nor was it possible to imagine Hioi or Hnohra worshipping a blood-stained idol. Unless, of course, the Hrossa were, after all, under the thumb of the Sorns, superior to their masters in all the qualities that human beings value, but intellectually inferior to them and dependent on them. It would be a strange but not inconceivable world. Heroism and poetry at the bottom, cold scientific intellect above it. And overtopping all, some dark superstition which scientific intellect helpless against the revenge of the emotional depths it had ignored, had neither will nor power to remove. A mumbo-jumbo. But Ransom pulled himself up. He knew too much now to talk that way. He and all his class would have called the El Dilla a superstition if they had been merely described to them. But now he had heard the voice himself. No, Oyasa was a real person, if he was a person at all. He had now been walking for about an hour, and it was nearly midday. No difficulty about his direction had yet occurred. He had merely to keep going uphill, and he was certain of coming out of the forest to the mountain wall sooner or later. Meanwhile, he felt remarkably well, though greatly chastened in mind. The silent purple half-light of the woods spread all around him, as it had spread on the first day he spent in Malacandra, but everything else was changed. He looked back on that time as on a nightmare, on his own mood at that time as a sort of sickness. Then all had been whimpering, unanalyzed, self-nourishing, self-consuming dismay. Now, in the clear light of an accepted duty, he felt fear indeed, but with it a sober sense of confidence in himself and in the world, and even an element of pleasure. It was the difference between a landsman in a sinking ship and a horseman on a bolting horse. Either may be killed, but the horseman is an agent as well as a patient. About an hour after noon, he suddenly came out of the wood into bright sunshine. He was only 20 yards from the almost perpendicular bases of the mountain spires, too close to them to see their tops. A sort of valley ran up in the re-entrant between two of them at the place where he had emerged, an unclimbable valley consisting of a single concave sweep of stone, which in its lower parts ascended steeply as the roof of a house, and farther up seemed almost vertical. At the top it even looked as if it hung over a bit, like a tidal wave of stone at the very moment of breaking, but this he thought might be an illusion. He wondered what the Hross's idea of a road might be. He began to work his way southward along the narrow, broken ground between wood and mountain. Great spurs of the mountains had to be crossed every few moments, and even in that lightweight world it was intensely tiring. After about half an hour, he came to a stream. He went a few paces into the forest, cut himself an ample supply of the groundweed, and sat down beside the water's edge for lunch. When he had finished, he filled his pockets with what he had not eaten, and proceeded. He began soon to be anxious about his road, for if he could make the top at all, he could do it only by daylight, and the middle of the afternoon was approaching. But his fears were unnecessary. When it came, it was unmistakable. The open way through the wood appeared on the left. He must be somewhere behind the Hross village now, and on the right he saw the road, a single ledge or, in places, a trench cut sideways and upwards across the sweep of such a valley as he had seen before. It took his breath away. The insanely steep, hideously narrow staircase without steps, leading up and up from where he stood to where it was an almost invisible thread on the pale green surface of the rock. But there was no time to stand and look at it. He was a poor judge of height, but he had no doubt that the top of the road was removed from him by a more than alpine distance. It would take him at least till sundown to reach it. Instantly he began the ascent. Such a journey would have been impossible on Earth. The first quarter of an hour would have reduced a man of Ransom's build and age to exhaustion. Here he was at first delighted with the ease of his movement, and then staggered by the gradient and length of the climb, which, even under Malacandrian conditions, soon bowed his back and gave him an aching chest and trembling knees. But this was not the worst. He heard already a singing in his ears, and noticed that despite his labor, there was no sweat on his forehead. The cold, increasing at every step, seemed to sap his vitality worse than any heat could have done. Already his lips were cracked, his breath as he panted showed like a cloud. His fingers were numb. He was cutting his way up into a silent Arctic world, and had already passed from an English to a Lapland winter. It frightened him, and he decided that he must rest here, or not at all. 100 paces more, and if he sat down, he would sit forever. He squatted on the road for a few minutes, slapping his body with his arms. The landscape was terrifying. Already the Handramit, which had made his world for so many weeks, was only a thin purple cleft sunk amidst the boundless level desolation of the Harandra, which now, on the farther side, showed clearly between and above the mountain peaks. But long before he was rested, he knew that he must go on or die. The world grew stranger. Among the Harossa, he had almost lost the feeling of being on a strange planet. Here it returned upon him with desolating force. It was no longer the world, scarcely even a world. It was a planet, a star, a waste place in the universe, millions of miles from the world of men. It was impossible to recall what he had felt about Hioi or Hwyn or the Ildilla or Oyasa. It seemed fantastic to have thought he had duties to such hobgoblins. If they were not hallucinations, met in the wilds of space, he had nothing to do with them. He was a man. Why had Weston and Devine left him alone like this? But all the time the old resolution, taken when he could still think, was driving him up the road. Often he forgot where he was going and why. The movement became a mechanical rhythm, from weariness to stillness, from stillness to unbearable cold, from cold to motion again. He noticed that the Handramit, now an insignificant part of the landscape, was full of a sort of haze. He had never seen a fog while he was living there. Perhaps that was what the air of the Handramit looked like from above. Certainly it was different air from this. There was something more wrong with his lungs and heart than even the cold and the exertion accounted for. And though there was no snow, there was an extraordinary brightness. The light was increasing, sharpening and growing whiter, and the sky was a much darker blue than he had ever seen on Malacandra. Indeed, it was darker than blue. It was almost black, and the jagged spires of rock standing against it were like his mental picture of a lunar landscape. Some stars were visible. Suddenly, he realized the meaning of these phenomena. There was very little air above him. He was near the end of it. The Malacandrian atmosphere lay chiefly in the Handramits. The real surface of the planet was naked or thinly clad. The stabbing sunlight and the black sky above were that heaven out of which he had dropped into the Malacandrian world, already showing through the last thin veil of air. If the top were more than 100 feet away, it would be where no man could breathe at all. He wondered whether the Harossa had different lungs and had sent him by a road that meant death for man. But even while he thought of this, he took note that those jagged peaks blazing in sunlight against an almost black sky were level with him. He was no longer ascending. The road ran on before him in a kind of shallow ravine, bounded on his left by the tops of the highest rock pinnacles, and on his right by a smooth ascending swell of stone that ran up to the true Harandra. And where he was, he could still breathe, though gasping, dizzy and in pain. The blaze in his eyes was worse. The sun was setting. The Harossa must have foreseen this. They could not live any more than he on the Harandra by night. Still staggering forward, he looked about for any sign of Algray's tower, whatever Algray might be. Doubtless he exaggerated the time during which he wandered and watched the shadows from the rocks lengthening towards him. It cannot really have been long before he saw a light ahead, a light which showed how dark the surrounding landscape had become. He tried to run, but his body would not respond. Stumbling in haste and weakness, he made for the light, thought he had reached it, and found that it was far farther off than he had supposed. Almost despaired, staggered on again, and came at last to what seemed a cavern mouth. The light within was an unsteady one, and a delicious wave of warmth smote on his face. It was firelight. He came into the mouth of the cave and then, unsteadily, round the fire and into the interior, and stood still, blinking in the light. When at last he could see, he discerned a smooth chamber of green rock, very lofty. There were two things in it. One of them, dancing on the wall and roof, was the huge, angular shadow of a Sawn. The other, crouched beneath it, was the Sawn himself. 15.
"Come in, small one,"
boomed the Sawn.
"Come in, and let me look at you."
Now that he stood face to face with the spectre that had haunted him ever since he set foot on Malagandra, Ransom felt a surprising indifference. He had no idea what might be coming next, but he was determined to carry out his program. And in the meantime, the warmth and more breathable air were a heaven in themselves. He came in, well in past the fire, and answered the Sawn. His own voice sounded to him a shrill treble.
"The Harassa have sent me to look for Oyasa," he said.
The Sawn peered at him.
"You are not from this world,"
it said suddenly.
"No,"
replied Ransom, and sat down. He was too tired to explain.
"I think you are from Tholkandra, small one,"
said the Sawn.
"Why?"
said Ransom.
"You are small and thick, and that is how the animals ought to be made in a heavier world. You cannot come from Glundandra, for it is so heavy that if any animals could live there, they would be flat like plates. Even you, small one, would break if you stood up on that world. I do not think you are from Paralandra, for it must be very hot. If any came from there, they would not live when they arrived here. So I conclude you are from Tholkandra."
"The world I come from is called Earth by those who live there,"
said Ransom.
"and it is much warmer than this. Before I came into your cave, I was nearly dead with cold and thin air."
The Sawn made a sudden movement with one of its long forelimbs. Ransom stiffened, though he did not allow himself to retreat, for the creature might be going to grab him. In fact, its intentions were kindly. Stretching back into the cave, it took from the wall what looked like a cup. Then Ransom saw that it was attached to a length of flexible tube. The Sawn put it into his hands.
"Smell on this,"
it said.
"The Rasa also need it when they pass this way."
Ransom inhaled and was instantly refreshed. His painful shortness of breath was eased, and the tension of chest and temples was relaxed. The Sawn and the lighted cavern, hitherto vague and dreamlike to his eyes, took on a new reality.
"Oxygen?"
he asked, but naturally the English word meant nothing to the Sawn.
"Are you called Algray?"
he asked.
"Yes,"
said the Sawn.
What are you called?
The animal I am is called Man, and therefore the Hrossa call me Haman. But my own name is Ransom.
Man. Ransom,
said the Sawn. He noticed that it spoke differently from the Hrossa, without any suggestion of their persistent initial H. It was sitting on its long wedge-shaped buttocks, with its feet drawn up close to it. A man in the same posture would have rested his chin on his knees, but the Sawn's legs were too long for that. Its knees rose high above its shoulders on each side of its head, grotesquely suggestive of huge ears, and the head down between them, resting its chin on the protruding breast. The creature seemed to have either a double chin or a beard. Ransom could not make out which in the firelight. It was mainly white or cream in colour, and seemed to be clothed down to the ankles in some soft substance that reflected the light. On the long fragile shanks where the creature was closest to him, he saw that this was some natural kind of coat. It was not like fur, but more like feathers. In fact, it was almost exactly like feathers. The whole animal, seen at close quarters, was less terrifying than he had expected, and even a little smaller. The face, it was true, took a good deal of getting used to. It was too long, too solemn, and too colourless, and it was much more unpleasantly like a human face than any inhuman creature's face ought to be. Its eyes, like those of all very large creatures, seemed too small for it, but it was more grotesque than horrible. A new conception of the Sawns began to arise in his mind. The ideas of giant and ghost receded behind those of goblin and gork.
Perhaps you are hungry, small one,
it said. Ransom was. The Sawn rose with strange spidery movements and began going to and fro about the cave, attended by its thin goblin shadow. It brought him the usual vegetable foods of Malacandra and strong drink, with the very welcome addition of a smooth brown substance which revealed itself to nose, eye, and palate, in defiance of all probability, as cheese. Ransom asked what it was. The Sawn began to explain painfully how the female of some animals secreted a fluid for the nourishment of its young, and would have gone on to describe the whole process of milking and cheese-making if Ransom had not interrupted it.
Yes,
he said.
We do the same on Earth. What is the beast you use?
It is a yellow beast with a long neck. It feeds on the forests that grow in the Handramit. The young ones of our people, who are not yet fit for much else, drive the beasts down there in the mornings, and follow them while they feed. Then before night they drive them back and put them in the caves.
For a moment Ransom found something reassuring in the thought that the Sawns were shepherds. Then he remembered that the Cyclops in Homer plied the same trade.
I think I've seen one of your people at this very work,
he said.
But the Hrossa, they let you tear up their forests?
Why should they not?
Do you rule the Hrossa?
Oyasa rules them.
And who rules you?
Oyasa.
But you know more than the Hrossa.
The Hrossa know nothing except about poems and fish, and making things grow out of the ground.
And Oyasa, is he a Sawn?
No, small one. I have told you, he rules all now.
So he pronounced now.
And everything in Malacandra.
I do not understand this, Oyasa,
said Ransom.
Tell me more.
Oyasa does not die,
said the Sawn.
And he does not breed. He is the one of his kind who was put into Malacandra to rule it when Malacandra was made. His body is not like ours, nor yours. It is hard to see, and light goes through it.
Like an Eldil?
Yes, he is the greatest of Eldila who ever come to Ahandra.
What are these Eldila?
Do you tell me, small one, that there are no Eldila in your world?
Not that I know of. But what are Eldila? And why can I not see them? Have they no bodies?
Of course they have bodies. There are a great many bodies you cannot see. Every animal's eyes see some things, but not others. Do you not know of many kinds of body in Thalcandra?
Ransom tried to give the Sorn some idea of the terrestrial terminology of solids, liquids, and gases. It listened with great attention.
That is not the way to say it,
it replied.
Body is movement. If it is at one speed, you smell something. If at another, you hear a sound. If at another, you see a sight. If at another, you neither see, nor hear, nor smell, nor know the body in any way. But mark this, small one, that the two ends meet.
How do you mean?
If movement is faster, then that which moves is more nearly in two places at once.
That is true.
But if the movement were faster still, it is difficult, for you do not know many words. You see that if you made it faster and faster, in the end the moving thing would be in all places at once, small one.
I think I see that.
Well, then, that is the thing at the top of all bodies, so fast that it is at rest, so truly body that it has ceased being body at all. But we will not talk of that. Start from where we are, small one. The swiftest thing that touches our senses is light. We do not truly see light. We only see slower things lit by it. So that for us, light is on the edge. The last thing we know before things become too swift for us. But the body of an Eldil is a movement swift as light. You may say its body is made of light, but not of that which is light for the Eldil. His light is a swifter movement, which for us is nothing at all. And what we call light is for him a thing like water, a visible thing, a thing he can touch and bathe in, even a dark thing when not illuminated by the swifter. And what we call firm things, flesh and earth, seems to him thinner and hard to see than our light, and more like clouds and nearly nothing. To us, the Eldil is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself, he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like cloud. And what is true light to him and fills the heaven, so that he will plunge into the rays of the sun to refresh himself from it, is to us the black nothing in the sky at night. These things are not strange, small one. though they are beyond our senses. But it is strange that the ill-diller never visit Thulkandra.
Of that I am not certain,
said Ransom. It had dawned on him that the recurrent human tradition of bright, elusive people sometimes appearing on the earth, elms, divas, and the like, might after all have another explanation that the anthropologists had yet given. True, it would turn the universe rather oddly inside out, but his experiences on the spaceship had prepared him for some such operation.
Why does Oyasa send for me?
He asked.
Oyasa has not told me,
said the Sorn.
But doubtless he would want to see any stranger from another Handra.
We have no Oyasa in my world,
said Ransom.
That is another proof,
said the Sorn,
that you come from Thulkandra, the silent planet.
What has that got to do with it?
The Sorn seemed surprised.
It is not very likely, if you had an Oyasa, that he would never speak to ours.
Speak to yours? But how could he? It is millions of miles away.
Oyasa would not think of it like that.
Do you mean that he ordinarily receives messages from other planets?
Once again, he would not say it that way. Oyasa would not say that he lives on Malacandra and that another Oyasa lives on another Earth. For him, Malacandra is only a place in the heavens. It is in the heavens that he and the others live. Of course they talk together.
Ransom's mind shied away from the problem. He was getting sleepy, and thought he must be misunderstanding the Sorn.
I think I must sleep, Algrey,
he said,
and I do not know what you are saying. Perhaps, too, I do not come from what you call Thulkandra.
We will both sleep presently,
said the Sorn.
But first I will show you Thulkandra.
It rose, and Ransom followed it into the back of the cave. Here he found a little recess, and running up within it, a winding stair. The steps, hewn for Sorns, were too high for a man to climb with any comfort, but using hands and knees he managed to hobble up. The Sorn preceded him. Ransom did not understand the light, which seemed to come from some small round object, which the creature held in its hand. They went up a long way, almost as if they were climbing up the inside of a hollow mountain. At last, breathless, he found himself in a dark but warm chamber of rock, and heard the Sorn saying,
She is still well above the southern horizon.
It directed his attention to something like a small window. Whatever it was, it did not appear to work like an earthly telescope, Ransom thought, though an attempt made next day to explain the principles of the telescope to the Sorn threw grave doubts on his own ability to discern the difference. He leaned forward, with his elbows on the sill of the aperture, and looked. He saw perfect blackness, and floating in the center of it, seemingly an arm's length away, a bright disk about the size of a half-crown. Most of its surface was featureless, shining silver. Towards the bottom markings appeared, and below them a white cap, just as he had seen the polar caps in astronomical photographs of Mars. He wondered for a moment if it was Mars he was looking at. Then, as his eyes took in the markings better, he recognized what they were: Northern Europe and a piece of North America. They were upside down, with the North Pole at the bottom of the picture, and this somehow shocked him. But it was the Earth he was seeing. Even perhaps England, though the picture shook a little and his eyes were quickly getting tired, and he could not be certain that he was not imagining it. It was all there in that little disc. London, Athens, Jerusalem, Shakespeare. There everyone had lived and everything had happened. And there, presumably, his backpack was still lying on the porch of the empty house near Stirk.
Yes,
He said dully to the Sorn.
that is my world.
It was the bleakest moment in all his travels. Your friend and mine, Moon's cat, is hidden somewhere in this video. Did you see him? If you didn't, it's okay. Go back to the start and watch the video again, and when you do see him, write the time code in which he appears in the comments field. And if you get it right, you get the chance to have the next video dedicated to you or someone you care about. He is quick and hard to spot, as you will see in the places he hid here, here, and here. Best of luck finding him. And don't forget,
Look out for the shadows.